When a president joked about buying Greenland, the world treated it like a late-night headline, a bizarre, almost farcical moment in diplomatic theater. But underneath that quip lies a far older story, a pattern of strategic calculation, secrecy, and cost that stretches back to World War II. Maps, declassified files, engineering plans, and eyewitness accounts together tell a darker, forensic story. Greenland has not been a curiosity on the margins of geopolitics. It has been for decades a stage on which the logic of great power strategy, technological hubris, and human consequence has played out. It began as a wartime imperative. After Denmark was occupied in 1940, Greenland effectively became a contested space. The United States, acting with the assent of the Danish ambassador in exile, moved to establish weather stations and airfields across the island, strategic nodes in a fight that would be won or lost by information, forecasts, air corridors, and the ability to track transatlantic routes. By the mid-1940s, agreements between Washington and officials representing Danish sovereignty created a framework for American presence that would outlast the immediate emergency. Those early installations were modest in scale but monumental in consequence. Weather stations such as Blue West 1 and a string of early warning outposts became the scaffolding for something larger. The Arctic was not simply an inhospitable fringe, it was the northern throat through which any transpolar approach would pass. For military planners in the emergent Cold War, control over Greenland meant control over approaches between power centers. The files we examined show planners writing plainly about the island's geostrategic logic. Airfields, refueling points, and radar platforms could not merely observe the North, they could anchor a whole posture of deterrence. By the early 1950s, that posture hardened into infrastructure. Thule Air Base, built near the northwest corner of Greenland, became a permanent, heavily engineered outpost beginning in 1951. It was conceived not as a weather station, but as a node in the Strategic Air Command's architecture. Runways were laid on permafrost and gravel. Radar arrays were installed to watch a polar sky that could channel intercontinental missiles. The speed of construction surprised even seasoned engineers. Men and machines arrived in waves, creating an American enclave that operated with mission-first urgency. Declassified construction reports in military correspondence reveal timelines measured in months where normal projects took years. Those engineering feeds came with material and human costs. Building on ice and permafrost required novel solutions, insulated structures, constantly shifting foundations, and the uneasy confidence that technology could bend one of the planet's most stubborn landscapes to human will. The metaphor of mastery is instructive because it is where the story of Camp Century begins.
Presented publicly as a scientific research station, a model city under the snow to test Arctic habitation and engineering, Camp Century, constructed in the late 1950s, carried a second, more discreet purpose, documented later in military planning documents. It was also the plausible front for Project Iceworm, an ambitious and secret plan to construct a network of mobile missile launch facilities under the ice. Project Iceworm's outlines appear in technical papers and planning memos now declassified. The concept was audacious. Build tunnels and emplacement sites within the ice sheet that would hide missile systems and their crews from surveillance. Camp Century, with its system of subterranean tunnels and a small nuclear reactor to power the camp, was the laboratory for those ideas. The official public story emphasized research into subsurface living and international cooperation. The classified record, when combined with testimony from engineers and later disclosures, reveals how military planners rehearsed a far more aggressive use of those technologies. The Arctic, however, is not a stable platform. Ice moves, glaciers flow. Structures that seem secure one year can be compromised the next. Within a decade, the engineers' confidence faced the intractable physical truth. The very ice that made concealment possible also carried the infrastructure inexorably downhill. Tunnels warped, support beams shifted. By the mid-1960s, the experiment at Camp Century had been curtailed, and the broader Project Iceworm concept quietly shelved. The reactor was removed, and large items were cataloged and, in theory, taken away. But not everything was removed, and not all risks were fully accounted for in a world that then assumed frozen was permanent. If Camp Century is an emblem of technological idealism meeting environmental reality,
The Thule B-52 crash in 1968 is a reminder of how close the Cold War came to spilling beyond classified lines into human and environmental harm. In January of that year, a U.S. bomber on nuclear alert crashed near Thule Air Base after an in-flight incident during refueling operations. The aircraft was carrying nuclear weapons. The crash scattered debris across the ice. The immediate priority for military authorities was recovery and containment. Records and journalistic investigations from the period describe a rapid cleanup operation aimed at removing sensitive material. Local workers, many of them Greenlandic, were employed in that cleanup. Later accounts from some of those workers and from communities near the site raised questions about exposure and health outcomes. Several studies and follow-up reports have examined those claims, but the scientific record remains contested. Anecdotal reports of illness exist alongside official findings that were inconclusive or limited by the data then available. The cleanup itself was conducted under intense secrecy and speed.
Military communications emphasize the need for rapid recovery to limit contamination and to secure weapons components. Documents released under declassification show a choreography of aircraft, engineers, and equipment moving in to retrieve fragments and decontaminate affected areas. What remains under the forensic microscope today is not simply the fact of the crash, that is long established, but the legacy of disposal and records management, which materials were recovered, which were buried, and how disposal records were archived. These are the traces historians and forensic investigators follow. After the Cold War, much of this presence quieted. Bases were downsized, alerts reduced, and many eyes turned away from the Arctic as a theater of strategic competition. Yet the retreat was not permanent. The melting of Greenland's ice, driven by global warming, has reopened questions that decades of geopolitics had pushed into cold storage. Satellite imagery that compares multi-decade time series shows accelerated ice loss along coastal margins, exposing new ground that had been locked under ice for millennia. As ice retreats, geologists and private firms point to mapped concentrations of rare earths, iron, and other minerals that are suddenly easier to access. Shipping routes that once required extended, treacherous detours are becoming seasonally navigable. Scientific reports warn of cascading environmental impacts. Economic assessments highlight potential resource value. Where opportunity appears, interest follows. In the last 2 decades, Chinese entities have made investments in Arctic research, port studies, and mineral exploration that are well documented in public filings and investigative reporting. Beijing's Arctic strategy emphasizes scientific cooperation and economic development, but those moves have raised questions among policymakers in Washington and capitals across Europe about long-term influence. Russia, for its part, has modernized its northern fleet, expanded its icebreaker capacity, and reopened bases along Arctic littoral zones, actions that Moscow frames in terms of national development and defense in a changing region. The 2019 moment, the headline about buying Greenland, deserves a forensic reading. It captured global attention because it collapsed decades of strategic history into a pithy, bizarre sentence. But it also echoed a pattern. The United States has, in various forms, treated Greenland as a strategic interest. In 1946, the U.S. did make an approach that looked like an offer to purchase, an episode now part of diplomatic archives, and Cold War planners advocated for near-continuous capabilities on the island. The spectacle of the 2019 exchange dramatized a long-standing reality. Greenland sits at the intersection of geography and power. How Greenland, and crucially, Greenlanders, respond matters.
Danish government statements, Greenlandic leaders, and local civil society have articulated a desire for autonomy, careful stewardship, and control over resources. Contemporary defense discussions show Denmark and Greenland negotiating complicated choices about sovereignty and security. Greenlandic voices have not been absent from the record. They appear in parliamentary debates, in statements to international press, and in local accounts of who worked at bases and who was called upon during cleanups. The narrative of an island simply passed between great powers erases these agencies. The documents and interviews make clear that local and national actors have continuously shaped outcomes. That does not absolve the hard trade-offs. The forensic record forces us to reckon with residues of the past, buried infrastructure at Camp Century, remnants of fuel and industrial waste left near early bases, and the still unresolved questions about contaminants from the Thule accident. Recent climate-driven reanalysis has placed Camp Century back on the map of concern. Engineering reports and environmental assessments indicate that warming could destabilize buried tunnels, potentially mobilizing long-dormant waste streams. Scientists have been explicit about uncertainty. The timelines, the modes of release, and the local impacts are not fully known.
What those reports do show is that the stability assumed in the 1950s and 1960s no longer holds. At the same time, contemporary investments, from Beijing's research initiatives to Russian Arctic patrols and renewed NATO interest in polar capabilities, are expressions of a continuing strategic logic. Control over Arctic sea lanes, early warning domains, and resource access remains salient for any actor whose national security or economic strategy intersects with northern approaches. The forensic pattern is clear. Technological possibility begets presence. Presence produces local cost. Over time, environmental change reconfigures risk. Outsiders return to exploit newly available geographies. It is a loop that repeats in different forms. Ethically, this loop raises concrete questions. Who is accountable for long-buried waste left by Cold War projects? How should sovereignty and local consent govern decisions about new exploration? What standard of evidence and care should be applied when assessing health claims made by workers involved in historical cleanups? The documentary and archival record can answer some of these questions. For others, information is partial, redacted, or missing. Declassified memos reveal operational priorities, but often obscure long-term environmental calculations. Health studies exist, but longitudinal data spanning decades with consistent exposure tracking remain limited. These gaps matter. They are where the forensic burden of proof meets the lived experience of communities. There are also hard policy choices implicit in this history.
One path emphasizes rapid resource development and strategic occupation as necessary to secure national interests. Another prioritizes environmental resilience and local governance, accepting constraints on extraction and designing cooperative security arrangements that center local rights. The real world rarely presents pure choices. It offers trade-offs, political bargaining, and legal settlements shaped by power. The archival picture suggests that choices made in times of perceived existential threat favored immediacy over long-term stewardship. Today's warming Arctic removes the luxury of assuming permanent cold. That should force a different calculus, one that foregrounds transparent records, independent environmental assessment, and meaningful involvement from Greenlandic authorities. What does the forensic trail leave us with? First, a clear through line. Greenland's strategic value is not recent propaganda. It is the product of decades of infrastructural investment and military planning. Second, a set of underreported legacies. Cold War engineering projects left materials and infrastructures whose risks were underestimated. Third, a present-day revival driven by climate and geopolitics that reproduces old logics in new forms. And finally, an urgent call for better documentation and public accountability. Many files remain redacted. Some cleanup records are incomplete. Consistent independent health studies are thin. These are not conspiratorial omissions, but bureaucratic and historical gaps that have real consequences. Forensic work depends on evidence. Where evidence is absent, we must be explicit about the limits of inference. We can read plans and timelines and see how strategic assumptions guided investment. We can interview former workers and community members and record patterns that warrant formal study. We can examine satellite photos that unmistakably show ice retreat and new shoreline exposures. Piecing these kinds of sources together yields a sober conclusion. The dark in this story is not melodrama. It is the accumulation of choices made under secrecy, the persistence of engineered artifacts in a changing environment, and the slow unspooling of repercussions that were rarely fully accounted for at the time. That reality demands policy responses as much as public scrutiny, greater transparency in archival holdings, independent environmental audits of former base sites, comprehensive health monitoring for affected communities, and genuine partnership with Greenlandic authorities would be starting points. International frameworks for Arctic governance exist in forms: scientific cooperation, shipping protocols, environmental conventions, but the record suggests those mechanisms need reinforcement to handle the scale and speed of change now underway. We do not conclude with tidy answers because the evidence does not permit them.
Many records remain sealed or redacted. Some technical assessments are only now being commissioned, and local communities continue to negotiate how to weigh opportunity against risk. What we do close with is an insistence. This is not a parable about an island waiting to be taken. It is a living jurisdiction with people, histories, and rights. The forensic record warns that strategic necessity, left unchecked by transparency and local consent, produces legacies that are difficult and costly to reverse. So as the ice thins and the headlines multiply, the questions we should be asking are practical and civic. What do we owe to those who labored in the shadow of secret projects? What mechanisms will ensure that environmental risk is assessed independently? How will Greenlandic governance shape the terms of any development or foreign investment? These are the questions that the historical record, when read carefully,
forces upon us. If this investigation resonated with you, subscribe for more deep dives into overlooked chapters of history. The story of Greenland is not an anecdote of purchasing or theatrical diplomacy. It is a forensic ledger of choices that combine strategy, secrecy, and environmental assumptions, choices whose after-effects are becoming visible as the planet changes. Histories of power often appear in archives and maps. The work of reckoning requires bringing those documents into conversation with the voices of communities and the measurements of science. That, in the end, is the dark forensic truth. When the cold no longer conceals, the past demands to be accounted for, and the future must be decided with fuller facts and broader consent. Tell us what you think. Is Greenland a strategic necessity, an opportunity for cooperative stewardship, or a new theater for competition? Like, comment, and subscribe, and keep asking the questions that the archives and the ice together insist we answer.